you've made a comment about the way you think about your composition in terms of I really think a lot about time. Every piece I write is in dialogue with the last piece and the next piece and the piece I wrote a decade ago. I find that fascinating. Very much like Mahler, I like that, and this is something that I'm drawn to, and it's something I really like about you as a composer and your compositions. That there's a trajectory, but not just a trajectory that's continuous. That there's connections with the past and the future. So as we talk about your development in composition, I want to keep that in mind. Uh, my understanding is that you moved from this first orchestral piece into some thoughts about strategic theory, military strategy, war theory, this leading to your game of attrition piece. Was that the next step?
Yeah, I think so. I think what I was doing from Aqua through kind of the early tens was or taking extra musical structures and sort of processes, not really narratives. I mean, you could see them as abstracted narratives, I suppose, um, but applying these kind of extra musical things to how I would put a piece together. So that worked through Vitruvius, through Sun Tzu, kind of scenarios in Sun Tzu's Art of War. But it was because the things that were outlined in both those with both those authors were kind of situations. So, for example, in Vitruvius, he described how they would build these catapults that were more like giant crossbows, where you would tune the ropes to launch a missile. And I just love the idea that sort of building this weapon and launching something required tuning. And it sort of gave me a musical idea that became my chamber ensemble piece, Ballastae, is how to build a ballista. And the idea of kind of tuning things to launch the piano and kind of the whole scenario of building a weapon like that. So it has a kind of abstracted narrative, but it's more about construction and process. And then with Sun Tzu, he describes, for example, that you have a large army going through a narrow valley, and there are guerrilla fighters. And what chance, do those guerrilla fighters have against the large army in that particular situation? For me, that just became a musical situation. I loved reading about these scenarios and thinking about ways of, say, so in my sextet, the piano and the clarinet are kind of guerrilla fighters against the string quartet. The string quartet has a certain direction, and then these two other kind of outlier instruments try to subvert it. So it's a way of setting up a kind of abstract drama or a kind of process of change that came out of reading these extra musical things and thinking about how they could be applied to a piece. So that was kind of a compositional phase, but I'm still interested in that. It's just then around 2009 with Game of Attrition, it came from that piece. It's a piece for a chamber orchestra that was played by commissioned by the New York Philharmonic, and it just happened to be the Darwin bicentenary. So I was reading The Origin of Species and reading about how it's not just survival of the fittest, but it's actually competing at at all the strata of existence. So if you have a level of creatures that eat worms, well, all the types of creatures that eat worms have to compete against each other in that particular level. So it got me thinking about instrumental registers. So every instrument that's in a sort of alto range could compete against each other. And so that was kind of the basis for the piece Game of Attrition, where instruments of similar ranges kind of duke it out in a piece and create a process. So by shifting that thinking into the natural world led to the pieces that I've done more recently, which use birdsong and just ideas from nature and the competition of nature, and in some cases the brutality of nature, but generally a process, more than a story or a narrative, sort of a setting up of conditions and making a piece out of that.
Yes, that's something also that's very interesting to me. Your pieces have arcs, but they're not narrative arcs. For instance, your piece, I'm trying to make sure I get that, Kiskadee, has a story in it, but it's a bird story. It's not a person story. It's a bird is existing and doing its thing, and another bird interferes with that. And there's no moral. There's nothing we're supposed to take away from it except the experience itself. That is in some ways challenging for a listener because we are story wired. How much of story do you allow in your pieces is, I guess, the question, given that you seem to like these abstracted situations that we enter and witness without owning them with story. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I think one of the great powers, one of the most powerful things in music is that it is by nature abstract, and we can apply our own narrative to it. And I think, certainly young listeners, children will just invent a story to whatever music they hear. And where things get a little didactic is when you're told this is the story and this is what happens, and this is the march to the scaffold, and there, clunk, the head's been chopped off. It doesn't give a lot of room for imagination. So I mean, I love those old, romantic tone poems and stories too, but I think music can give you that and a lot more, and that abstraction allows a kind of freedom of interpretation for a listener and for a performer. But I don't, I would find it very limiting to say, this is the hero. Like, it's like I really enjoyed writing a piano concerto that wasn't heroic, that has virtuosity without a kind of, individual against the orchestra, whole thing. Just because that's really been done a lot, and it's the idea of the soloist more as a saboteur was interesting to me in terms of a way to be subtle but still be the big concert soloist. So I explore that in my piano concerto, Art of War, but there isn't, a fixed point where you say this is what happened. It's open to the imagination, but I think you can have that abstraction and still have a lot of drama. And the drama is in timing and in the contrasts and in the trajectory and the sense of inevitability. Those things are really, really important to me compositionally. So I guess there's a kind of architectural kind of tightness in terms of the way that I like to construct things, because I like things to work and drive forward. So that can be interpreted in a very narrative way if the listener wants that. And what I like to do with program notes and pre-concert talks is sort of give an idea of sort of things to think about with the piece without saying exactly what's going on. And I hope that overcomes some of that barrier you're talking about with listening to new music and maybe not having the old romantic tropes, but maybe still something just as compelling in a fresher way.
Would you prefer not to have to provide that explanation at all? I mean, I'm an educated composition listener and an educated composer myself, and I definitely appreciated having some context listening to your pieces. Without that context, it wasn't that I didn't enjoy your pieces, but I was having a completely different experience. I wouldn't know that it was a Kiskadee bird call at all. I would simply think, here are some sounds, and I'm listening to the sounds go, and I wouldn't be able to put a story on it at all. And that's with all that I happen to know about music and composition. So,
right. Yeah, I mean that's the price we pay with music being so abstract, So I think, I had a lot of ambivalence about that with my very early works. It was really helpful at Yale because we had these public concerts and people would come and critics would come to hear student work because it was always put alongside the guest composers, really well-known guests. So people would come to hear our pieces and there would be critics responding, which was quite really terrifying. But I realized also just from audience members talking to me afterwards that when I gave a little hint in the title and the program note of what I've been thinking about with the piece, people responded so much more, were really much much warmer response in terms of what people said and what they got out of it. And so that helped me decide. I actually had two performances of the same piece and I changed a couple of movement titles from the sort of more evocative title to a more abstracted one. And the difference in how people reacted and what they said to me was really stark. And I thought, well, if I'm thinking about these things, there's nothing wrong with sharing that because it's going to help people get more out of it. And there's nothing wrong with that.
So that brings me to another point. You've mentioned in your that you write music that you want to hear, and I don't know if I'm getting it correctly when I say that. Oh yeah, you said don't bother second guessing what anyone else wants to hear. Now that's slightly in contradiction with what you said you had to do with your description. I mean, you were thinking about, to some extent, helping your listener. And
the key word to that quotation is second guessing. That's what I avoid, and that's what I tell my students to avoid. Don't think this is going to be the really emotive bit, and this is going to be the really exciting bit, and I want everybody to feel this at this point. You don't know how people or this is too modern, or this is too old-fashioned, or this is too this or that. That's what I mean. And also, having had my career back and forth between Britain and the United States too, you don't know, and having international performances, you don't know what your audience is going to think or what they're going to think is in style, or what's derivative or what's too modern. So don't second guess it. That's what I mean by it. And I think that's what it's thinking that way and kind of disconnecting myself from anticipated audience and critical reactions by just writing what I think works and hoping that I can carry people along with that. That's a larger endeavor than the specific, narrative or not narrative ideas in specific pieces. That quote, I guess, is more about style and fashion and movements in the art and what's going on. So I think by thinking that way, it's helped me to avoid getting caught up in particular movements or schools or groups of composition, of which there are so many. And I've never been a card-carrying member of any particular way of composing. There are a lot of things I like, a lot of things I don't like, but thinking that way has just helped me to stay free and true to what I want to do without worrying about what my colleagues are doing or what my old teachers are doing or what my young professional and former students are doing. You've got to create work that satisfies your need to create and is as well done as you can possibly make it. And then you hope for the best. You can't know how anyone's going to respond to that.
I really appreciate that clarification. As a composer myself, I am first listening to whatever is going on in here and writing that down. But after that, I do go back to the piece and then consider it from the listener's point of view and say, well, did I fall off the track here, or is this really going to be heard the way I want it to be heard? Do you go that extra step and also think, not only thinking, like you said, don't just think about what people want to hear, but do you also think about what people want to hear when you compose?
I think I'm really thinking about a piece and how it works. And is it going to work? Is it convincing? And that can mean structurally, that can mean, in terms of its sonority, it can mean duration, it could, all kinds of creative decisions. When you finish something and you write that double bar, is it done? Is the slow section long enough and the fast section long enough or short enough? That kind of thing. You absolutely must please yourself because that's all you've got. And then when you try to imagine your listener, I mean, you can imagine your ideal listener. Oh, whoever listens to my music is really gonna love Barrio and Shostakovich and hate Beethoven. You can't. You don't know. But what you can know, at least in a classical concert milieu. I mean, I'm writing for the instruments that have had all this history, and presumably for the audience that is listening to all of that. And so, most of my compositions are on mixed programs with music from different historical periods. And I think that's great. That's the context that I'm working with. When I write for violin, I'm thinking about the history of writing for the violin as well as what I just feel like doing. So I think, most classical programming gives you a nice sense of context when there's a new piece included, and you hear different ways of thinking about these incredible instruments that are part of the tradition. But it's also, I mean, it's more exhausting, but it's also really interesting to be part of new music concerts, because if the programmers have done a decent job, you're going to hear a good range of ideas about what's going on for the string quartet right now, for example. And that's really great too. But in both those situations, you have a very different group of listeners. So, and then if a piece is broadcast, I mean, who knows who's hearing the piece? And that's really fascinating. I mean, broadcast gets you such an incredible range of listeners that could never happen any other way, never mind streaming and all this stuff. So, you can't anticipate all those different ways of listening, all those different kinds of people. All you can do is hope that your piece is really well done so that it carries them through and they want to keep listening and get something out of it. What they get out of it, what they think the piece means, all that stuff, you can't know. So why second guess it? We can imagine other listeners, but I think composers only have ourselves as listeners, and you've got to be convinced that the piece works and do your best to make the piece work.
I understand the sense of what you're saying. I think it's great, and I think it's something you should definitely tell your students. Not that you need me to tell you that, but I'm going to take it a step further. I think there are some composers that do their best to mitigate the effect of multiple listeners and say, well, I know lots of different people are going to be listening, and I'm going to do my best to minimize the difference between what they hear. I get the feeling you like the idea that different people are going to hear your music differently. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the great freedoms of writing concert music as opposed to commercial music or film music. When I'm lucky enough to write for a soloist or an ensemble and I know how they can play and all the amazing things they can do, I just want to write a piece for them, for that situation. And hope that, people can listen and get something out of it. And some do, and some are always going to hate it. You can't control that kind of stuff. But, some people also hate Beethoven. So what can you do? You just, and some people only like really avant-garde stuff and don't like any of the old stuff. I mean, for me, it's the whole canon, from medieval to the most recent that's interesting. I just love classical music in addition to other genres and things, but that's my genre. And I think anyone who likes any of those aspects hopefully can like recent pieces by living composers. One can only hope.